Welcome to Midnight Affairs, where secrets unravel, desires ignite, and bold stories keep you on the edge. Tonight begins Chapter 1, our very first story where passion meets betrayal in the most gripping way. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next thrilling chapter. The calm before the storm. It started like any other weekday in Lakeside, a serene suburb where life felt predictable, even idyllic. David Reed, a 36-year-old graphic designer, had built a life that, on the surface, seemed fulfilling. His modest home was warm and inviting, his job was steady, and his 8-year marriage to Emily seemed like a partnership built on trust. But sometimes appearances lie. A morning like any other. David's mornings were as routine as clockwork. At exactly 7 a.m., the soft buzz of his alarm nudged him awake. He'd stretch, groan a little, then reach for his glasses. By the time he shuffled into the kitchen, Emily would already be perched at the counter, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone. This morning was no exception, or so it seemed. As he entered the kitchen, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee greeted him. Emily, in her favorite worn blue robe, looked up with a teasing smile. "Morning, sleepyhead." "Morning," he replied, chuckling. "You're up early and looking bright. Big plans today?" "Not really," she said with a shrug, her smile lingering. "Just the usual errands." Their conversation drifted into familiar, easy banter. Yet, beneath the surface, David couldn't shake a subtle sense of unease. Emily seemed distracted. Her phone lay face down on the counter, an unusual habit for someone so connected. An unexpected message. David's day carried on as planned. He dropped Emily off at the store, then headed to work. Yet, his thoughts lingered on her distracted demeanor, replaying their morning conversation in his head. Then a text lit up his phone. "Hey man, can we talk later? Something I need to tell you." It was from Jake, his best friend since high school. They didn't usually exchange cryptic messages, so the tone of this one felt off. David quickly replied, "Everything okay?" Jake's response was brief and uncharacteristic. "Not really. I'll call tonight." All day David's focus wavered. His mind bounced between Jake's text and Emily's unusual behavior. Was there a connection, or was he overthinking? The call that changed everything. After dinner, David stepped onto the porch, the chill of winter air biting against his skin. The quiet hum of the neighborhood amplified the tension in his chest as he dialed Jake. "Hey," David said, his voice steady though his heart pounded. "David," Jake began, his tone heavy, "this isn't easy to say, but I think you need to know." David clenched his jaw. "Know what?" "I saw Emily today," Jake said, hesitating. "She didn't see me, but she wasn't alone." A cold sensation rippled through David. "What do you mean?" "She was with a guy. They looked close," Jake continued, his words careful. "I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the way she was with him, it didn't look innocent." David gripped the porch railing. "You're sure it was her?" "I'm sure," Jake said firmly. "I thought you'd want to know before it got worse." The beginning of uncertainty. As the call ended, David stood motionless, staring into the darkened street. His mind raced, fragments of their life together colliding with this new revelation. Emily's smile this morning, her phone lying face down, Jake's cryptic warning, it all seemed connected now. Trust isn't about never doubting, Emily had told him years ago. It's about believing in each other despite the doubts. Tonight that belief felt fragile. David wasn't sure what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. This was no longer the life he thought he knew. The calm of his predictable world had shattered, and the storm was just beginning. The clue that changed everything. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, but David barely noticed. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, Jake's words still ringing in his ears. They looked close. Emily's side of the bed was empty, the sheets already cool. She had mentioned meeting a friend early, but as David tried to recall the conversation, he realized how vague she had been. Her cheerful demeanor the night before suddenly felt rehearsed, as though she'd been hiding something in plain sight. A forgotten phone and a moment of truth. In the kitchen, David sipped his coffee, trying to shake off the unease. That's when he noticed Emily's phone sitting on the counter, its charging cable coiled neatly beside it. She rarely left it behind. Her phone was practically an extension of her hand. The thought gnawed at him. Why would she forget something so important? His eyes lingered on the device, an internal battle brewing. He'd always considered himself a trusting husband, but Jake's warning and Emily's recent behavior made his chest tighten. Finally, he gave in, reasoning, if there's nothing to hide, there's no harm in looking. The screen lit up under his touch, the lock screen displaying a simple 4-digit passcode. Emily's habit of using her birthday for everything worked in his favor. Hesitant but resolute, David entered the code. The phone unlocked with a quiet click, and his heart pounded in his chest. Uncovering the truth. Scrolling through her messages, David found the usual. Group chats with friends, reminders from work, and mundane exchanges about grocery lists. But one contact stood out. Jenna, yoga? Something about it felt off. Emily hadn't mentioned yoga in months. With a deep breath, David opened the thread. The messages hit him like a punch to the gut. They weren't from Jenna. The tone was unmistakably romantic. Words like, "I couldn't stop thinking about last night, and you looked so stunning over dinner," flashed on the screen. The sender was clearly a man, his compliments bold and intimate. As David scrolled further, his worst fears were confirmed. Mixed in with the texts were photos. A selfie of Emily smiling coyly, her hair slightly tousled, and another of her with the man in a dimly lit restaurant. The way they leaned toward each other told a story no words could. David's hands trembled as he set the phone back down. A storm of emotions surged within him. Betrayal, humiliation, anger. His mind raced with questions, each one sharper than the last. How long has this been happening? Who is he? What did I miss? Strategizing for the truth. Confronting Emily immediately crossed David's mind, but he hesitated. If he acted now, she might deny everything or deflect by focusing on his snooping. He needed evidence, something irrefutable. That evening, Emily returned home, her usual cheerful self. She kissed David on the cheek and asked about his day, her tone casual, her smile warm. But to David it all felt hollow. The person standing in front of him wasn't the woman he thought he knew. During dinner he forced himself to play along. He laughed at her jokes and even shared a story from work, masking his inner turmoil with practiced ease. Emily didn't seem to notice his carefully crafted performance. Later that night, when she stepped into the shower, David returned to her phone. This time he took screenshots of the incriminating messages and emailed them to himself. If things escalated, he would need proof she couldn't dismiss as a misunderstanding. The calm before the collapse. Lying in bed that night, David stared at the ceiling, his thoughts a whirlwind. The man he'd been that morning, trusting, content, felt like a stranger now. In his place was someone determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Sometimes, he thought, you have to break something to see what's inside. The cracks in their marriage were no longer subtle. They were widening with every passing moment, and David knew it was only a matter of time before the whole structure collapsed. For now, he waited, knowing that the next step would define everything that came after. Would you like me to continue with how David navigates his next moves, or focus on Emily's perspective to deepen the narrative? Piecing together the truth. For the next few days, David kept a close eye on Emily, noticing details he'd once ignored. She seemed unusually distracted, glancing at her phone with quick, nervous movements. Her alibis, yoga classes, errands, or lunch with friends, sounded plausible on the surface, but now they felt carefully rehearsed. The cracks in her stories were subtle but undeniable. David realized he couldn't do this alone. He needed someone to ground him, to offer perspective and support. So he called Jake, the one person he trusted implicitly. A confidant's advice. They met at a familiar pub, their usual spot for honest conversations. Over beers, David laid everything bare. The suspicious messages, the hotel receipts, and the unease that had taken over his life. Jake listened intently, his expression a mix of disbelief and concern. "I don't even know what to say, man," Jake said after a long pause. "You two always seemed rock solid. But if this is what's happening, you've got to get the full story." David nodded, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "That's the plan. But I need more than gut feelings or screenshots. I need real proof." Jake leaned in, his tone quiet but firm. "Don't confront her yet. Gather as much as you can. If she's lying to you, she might try to twist the truth." Digging deeper. The next morning, while Emily was in the shower, David cautiously accessed her phone again. This time he went beyond her messages. He checked her email and found receipts for expensive dinners at restaurants he'd never visited with her, and even a hotel booking that coincided with a supposed work trip. He forwarded these to himself, adding to his growing arsenal of evidence. David also began tracking her movements. One evening, when Emily said she had a yoga class, David decided to follow her. Jake joined him for moral support, sitting in the passenger seat as they tailed her car at a safe distance. David's heart pounded as they watched Emily pull into the parking lot of a small cafe on the other side of town. A man in his early 40s greeted her with a hug that lingered too long to be friendly. Emily's smile, A warm, genuine expression David hadn't seen in months, cut through him like a knife. Jake broke the silence, his voice low. Well, that's definitely not yoga. David clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. He snapped a few photos of the pair through the cafe window, his jaw tight. The other man. Back home, David couldn't shake the image of Emily with the stranger. Late that night, while Emily slept, he stayed up, combing through his findings. Using the cafe's location and a few details he'd observed, he identified the man, Chris Harper, a divorced real estate agent. His social media painted a picture of a charming, confident man who was clearly accustomed to attention. The pieces were falling into place, but with every new revelation, David felt the weight of betrayal grow heavier. He couldn't believe the woman he'd loved for years had built this hidden world. Plan takes shape. Over the next few days, David's observations sharpened. Emily's excuses became more transparent. Her late-night work calls, sudden interest in solo trips, and guarded responses about her plans all pointed to the same conclusion. One evening while Emily was out, David called Jake over. They spread the evidence across the dining table like detectives solving a case. "This guy, Chris," Jake said, pointing to a photo on David's laptop. "You think it's been going on for months?" David nodded, his voice quiet but firm. "The hotel receipt, the texts, the dinners, it all lines up." Jake leaned back, arms crossed. "So what's next? You've got enough to confront her, but are you ready for that?" David hesitated. Part of him wanted to storm into the room, demand answers, and lay everything bare. But he knew he needed to be strategic. If he acted on emotion, Emily could deny everything or manipulate the situation. "Not yet," David said. "I'll wait for the right moment, something she can't talk her way out of." The breaking point. That moment came sooner than expected. Late one night, David overheard Emily on the phone. She was in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones, but the warmth in her voice was unmistakable. "I can't wait to see you again," she said softly. "I'll figure something out for next weekend." David's so busy with work, he won't even notice. The words hit David like a physical blow. He retreated to the bedroom before she could see him, his mind racing. The time for waiting was over. He had the proof, the context, and now the clarity. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, David felt both dread and resolve. He wasn't just confronting Emily about an affair. He was about to confront the reality that his life was about to change forever. The confrontation deepens. David barely slept after hearing Emily's whispered phone call. Her plans for the weekend left no room for doubt. She was meeting Chris. The next morning, she casually mentioned spending the day with her friend Lisa, flashing a practiced smile that made David's stomach turn. He forced himself to respond with the same ease, hiding the storm beneath the surface. Once Emily left, he called Jake. "She's meeting him today," David said, gripping his phone tightly. "I need to see it with my own eyes. Are you in?" Jake didn't hesitate. Always tracking the truth. They followed Emily at a distance, Jake driving while David sat rigid in the passenger seat, his fists clenched in his lap. She headed out of town, finally pulling into a secluded park by a serene lake. David's chest tightened as he spotted Chris waiting by a shaded bench, holding a picnic basket. Emily's face lit up as she approached him, her carefree laughter carrying on the breeze. "Stay here," David said to Jake, his voice low but steady. "This is between me and them." Jake gave him a long look. "If it gets ugly, I'm coming in." David stepped out of the car, his footsteps deliberate as he approached the couple. Emily and Chris were engrossed in conversation, leaning close as though they were the only two people in the world. David's voice sliced through the air, cold and sharp. "Enjoying the picnic?" Emily's head snapped up, her expression shifting from shock to dread in an instant. Chris straightened, his face hardening as he assessed the situation. "David, what are you doing here?" Emily stammered. David ignored her, turning his gaze to Chris. "And you must be Chris Harper. Divorced real estate agent, right? Likes picnics and apparently married women?" Chris stood, his posture tense. "Look man, I don't know what you think you know." David cut him off, stepping closer. "I know enough. The text, the hotel stays, the lies. This isn't just some innocent friendship. No more lies." Emily reached for David's arm, her voice trembling. "David, please. Let's go somewhere private and talk." He pulled away, his tone unyielding. "No. We're doing this here. No more running. No more excuses." Chris cleared his throat, his voice defensive but steady. "If you want to blame someone, blame me. I pursued her. She told me things were bad between you two. That your marriage was already falling apart." David's jaw tightened as he turned to Emily. Is that true? Is that what you've been telling him? Emily's eyes filled with tears. David, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I felt so alone. You were always busy with work and I... David laughed bitterly, cutting her off. Alone? So this is my fault now? Your solution to feeling alone was this? He gestured toward Chris, who stood silently. The tension hung thick in the air, but then Chris spoke, his tone hesitant. David, there's something else you should know. David froze, his anger momentarily giving way to confusion. What now? Chris glanced at Emily, who shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't. Chris ignored her. I'm not the only one. There's another guy. Someone she works with. The final blow. David's world tilted. He turned to Emily, his voice barely a whisper. Is that true? Another man? Emily broke down, her sobs shaking her frame. I didn't mean for it to happen. I was looking for something. Something I wasn't getting at home. David felt the weight of her words crush him. The betrayal was deeper than he'd imagined. The marriage he thought he knew had been a facade, crumbling piece by piece behind his back. Chris stepped back, his expression remorseful. I didn't know about the other guy until recently. I'm sorry. If I'd known... He trailed off, shaking his head. David stared at Emily, the storm inside him raging. He had come here seeking clarity, but now the truth felt like too much to bear. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice trembling but resolute. This is over. Whatever this is, I'm done. Emily reached out, her tear-streaked face desperate. David, please? He didn't let her finish. Turning on his heel, he walked away without looking back, her cries fading into the background. Moving forward. Jake was waiting by the car, his face etched with concern. Well? David climbed into the passenger seat, his hands trembling. Drive, he said hoarsely. Jake didn't ask questions. He simply started the engine and pulled away, leaving the park, and the wreckage of David's marriage, in the rearview mirror. The final betrayal. David thought he'd hit rock bottom after catching Emily with Chris at the park. He had confronted the lies, endured the excuses, and tried to process the unthinkable. But what he didn't realize was that the betrayal ran deeper, far deeper than he ever imagined. A quiet night, an uneasy feeling. Days passed in an emotional haze. Their shared home felt like a prison, every corner haunted by memories of a life that now felt hollow. Jake, David's closest friend, had been there through it all. You need to get out, Jake insisted one night. Sitting here isn't helping. Take a drive. Clear your head. David agreed, but as he drove, he wasn't seeking peace. Something gnawed at him, a suspicion he couldn't shake. He found himself outside Emily's office building, the fluorescent lights on the 4th floor glowing like a beacon. It was nearly 9 p.m., but her car was still in the lot. She's still here, he murmured, stepping out of his car. A shocking discovery. Inside, the building was eerily quiet, the hum of the elevator the only sound as it carried him to the 4th floor. His footsteps echoed in the hall as he approached the conference room, where light spilled out from the glass walls. Through the glass he saw her. Emily stood with a tall, sharply dressed man whose easy confidence radiated even from a distance. They were close, too close, leaning in over a stack of papers. She smiled at him, the same warm, intimate smile she used to reserve for David. And then David saw it. The man reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. She didn't flinch. She leaned into his touch. David's breath hitched, his chest tightening. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an innocent work meeting. It was betrayal, intimate, undeniable. Before he knew it, he pushed the door open. The confrontation. The two jumped apart, their expressions cycling from shock to guilt. David. Emily gasped, her voice trembling. The man straightened, trying to maintain composure. I'm sorry, I don't think we've met. Save it, David cut in, his voice sharp. His eyes locked on Emily. How long? Emily's face went pale. David, it's not what it looks like. Don't, he snapped, his voice rising. Don't insult me by pretending. I saw it all. He turned to the man, his anger simmering. And you? Who the hell are you? The man hesitated but finally extended a hand. I'm Michael. Emily's colleague. David ignored the hand, his fists clenching. Colleague? Is that the word for it now? Emily stepped between them, her voice desperate. David, please stop. Let's go somewhere private to talk. Private? David's laugh was bitter, raw. That's what you said at the park. How many times, Emily? How many more lies have you told me? The truth unravels. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Michael, however, spoke up, his tone measured and almost patronizing. I think we should all calm down before this gets out of hand. David turned on him, his voice cutting like a blade. Don't tell me to calm down. You've been sneaking around with my wife, and you think I'll stand here and play nice? Michael looked to Emily for support, but she was visibly shaking, her hands trembling as she reached for David. Please, she pleaded. Just let us explain. There's nothing left to explain, David said coldly. You've already explained everything with your actions. Emily broke down, her sobs echoing in the silent room. But David was done. The betrayal was too deep, the pain too sharp. Without another word, he turned and walked out. The end of the road. Outside, the cold night air hit him like a slap. For a moment he stood there, his mind racing. This wasn't just the end of his marriage, it was the collapse of the foundation he had built his life on. When he reached his car, Jake was waiting, the engine idling. Well? Jake asked, his voice cautious. David climbed into the passenger seat, his movements heavy. Drive, he said, his voice hollow. Jake didn't ask any more questions. He simply put the car in gear and pulled away, the glowing office building fading into the distance. Behind them, David left not just a shattered marriage but the ashes of a life he could never return to. Climactic confrontation. David had spent days consumed by a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, and confusion swirling in a storm that refused to settle. Jake, his unwavering confidant, had tried to guide him through it, but David wasn't ready to listen. Until one evening, as they sat in the dim light of his living room, Jake delivered a hard truth. You're stuck in limbo, Jake said firmly. You won't find peace until you face this head-on. Those words lingered, gnawing at David until they became impossible to ignore. An unlikely setting for a reckoning. 3 days later, David found himself standing in the center of a bustling restaurant, its warm chatter and clinking glasses fading into a dull hum. His eyes locked on the corner booth. Emily was there, sitting with Michael. Their heads were close, their postures relaxed, but to David, every detail screamed betrayal. It wasn't the first time he'd seen them together since the confrontation at her office, but this time he couldn't hold back. With measured steps, David strode toward the booth, his presence cutting through the ambience like a knife. The casual energy in the room shifted as diners noticed the tension radiating from him. Emily was the first to spot him. Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. Michael turned to follow her gaze, his jaw tightening as recognition dawned. David, Emily said, her voice wavering. David stopped at the table, his expression hard. We need to talk. Michael began to rise, his demeanor cautious but defensive. This isn't the time or place. Sit down, David interrupted, his voice commanding. The authority in his tone froze Michael mid-motion, forcing him to glance at Emily for reassurance. David, please, Emily pleaded, her voice soft but desperate. David shook his head. No more excuses. No more sidestepping. We're doing this now. Demanding the truth. David pulled out a chair and sat down, leaning forward as his gaze bore into Emily's. I've spent days trying to understand, he began, his voice tight but steady. Trying to figure out when it all started. What I did wrong. But here's the truth, I'm done torturing myself. I came here because I need to hear it from you. How long has this been going on? Emily hesitated, her hands trembling as she toyed with her glass. David, it's not that simple. It is that simple, David cut in. You made a choice. I just want to know why. Michael, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Look, this isn't helping anyone. Maybe we should take this somewhere private? David's head snapped toward him, his eyes narrowing. You don't get to mediate this. You're not a bystander, you're part of the mess. Michael opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. Emily took a shaky breath. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, she whispered. Then how was it supposed to happen? David asked, his voice sharp. Were you planning to leave me? Or was this just something you thought you could hide forever? Her silence was deafening, the unspoken answer hanging heavy in the air. The breaking point. Michael reached out, placing a hand on Emily's arm in a gesture of comfort. To David it felt like a taunt. That's enough, Michael said, his voice measured but firm. David leaned forward, his voice low and cutting. Enough? You don't get to decide when enough is enough. You don't get to tell me how to feel after sneaking around with my wife. David, please stop, Emily said, her voice breaking. This isn't going to fix anything. No, it won't, David admitted, his voice raw with emotion. But at least I can walk away knowing I didn't let you twist this into something it's not. Emily's eyes brimmed with tears. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, David said flatly. And now there's nothing left to save. He stood, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Looking at Emily and Michael one last time, he let out a bitter sigh. "I hope it was worth it," he said quietly before turning and walking away. The beginning of the end. As David stepped into the cool night air, he felt an unexpected sense of release. The confrontation hadn't brought closure. Not entirely, but it had given him something else. For the first time he felt the weight of the past lifting, just enough for him to take the first step forward. And that was a start. The aftermath of betrayal. The confrontation at the restaurant didn't just end with raised voices and hurt feelings. It rippled outward, dismantling the carefully constructed lives of Emily and Michael. By morning, what might have remained a private dispute had transformed into public gossip, fueled by whispers that seemed to grow with every retelling. Her reputation shattered. Emily, once admired for her poise and professionalism, now walked into a workplace filled with judgmental glances and whispered conversations. The break room, once her sanctuary of camaraderie, had turned into a cold, isolating space. Her colleagues spoke to her only when necessary, their clipped words barely concealing their disapproval. Michael's fall was even steeper. His charm, once disarming, now rang hollow. The respect he'd earned over years of dedication crumbled as clients pulled out of meetings and peers began to distance themselves. His name became synonymous with scandal, his every action scrutinized under a harsh spotlight. The breaking point came during the firm's quarterly board meeting. Michael sat at the polished oak table, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on him. The chairman, a man known for his unwavering focus on the company's values, leaned forward, his expression as unyielding as the table between them. "Michael," he began, his voice calm but unrelenting, "your actions have brought negative attention to this firm. Our reputation is built on trust and integrity, values that now seem compromised in your hands." Michael attempted to defend himself. "My personal life hasn't interfered with my professional responsibilities." "It's not just about responsibilities," the chairman interrupted, his tone sharper. "It's about perception. And right now, the perception is that you've jeopardized everything this firm stands for." The decision was swift. Michael was to resign, effective immediately. By the end of the day, whispers turned into a roar as the news of his dismissal spread. Emily's isolation. Emily faced her own reckoning. At work, the whispered judgments morphed into cold silences and veiled accusations. Her once solid friendships with colleagues dissolved, replaced by polite indifference or outright avoidance. Outside of the office, the fallout was just as brutal. Social media posts hinted at her involvement, her name becoming a shorthand for betrayal. Every glance from a passerby felt heavy with unspoken words. The weight of her choices bore down on her and she struggled to carry it. David's reclamation. For David, the aftermath was different. The restaurant confrontation, while painful, had been the closure he needed to reclaim his life. He threw himself into photography, a passion he had sidelined for too long. Each click of the camera became an act of healing, a way to transform his pain into art. The soft glow of a sunset, the sharp lines of a cityscape, the fleeting expression of a stranger, each frame reminded him of the beauty that still existed. One evening, as he reviewed his latest shots, his phone buzzed with a message from Jake. "Did you see this?" The link led to a local news article with a scathing headline: "Corporate Scandal Rocks Local Firm. Executive and Manager at Center of Controversy." The piece detailed Michael's resignation and the fallout within the company, painting a damning picture of the chaos their actions had caused. Emily's name was mentioned too, her career seemingly hanging by a thread. David closed the article, conflicted. He didn't revel in their misfortune but couldn't deny the sense of justice it brought. For the first time in weeks, he felt a lightness, an easing of the burden he'd carried. A spark of hope. The next day, David visited a small cafe near the park, a place he hadn't been to in years. As he sipped his coffee, lost in thought, a woman approached him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice warm and curious. "Are you David? I think I recognize you from your photography exhibit a few years ago." Surprised, David looked up. "Yes, that's me." Her face lit up. "I just wanted to say your work is incredible. It actually inspired me to pick up photography again." Her words, genuine and unexpected, struck a chord. As they chatted, David felt something stir, a spark of hope, a reminder that his life was far from over. A new chapter. For Emily and Michael, the choices they had made led to their unraveling, their lives marked by scandal and regret. But for David, their betrayal was a turning point. The scars they left behind were real, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they became part of his story, a testament to resilience, growth, and the unyielding strength to rebuild after loss. As he packed up his camera that evening, David smiled to himself. The path forward wasn't clear, but it was his to walk, and that was more than enough. Consequences and healing. The confrontation at the restaurant set off a chain reaction that upended Emily and Michael's carefully balanced lives. The exposure of their affair stripped away their veneer of control, leaving both to grapple with the weight of their decisions. Emily's isolation, the loss of trust. Once respected and admired at her firm, Emily found her standing eroded overnight. Her colleagues, who had once sought her advice and shared easy camaraderie, now avoided her. The subtle signs of professional alienation were everywhere. Meetings rescheduled without her, emails left unanswered, and an unmistakable chill in the air when she entered a room. Her promotion, once all but guaranteed, was quietly rescinded. Leadership never openly criticized her but made it clear she was no longer part of their long-term plans. Facing mounting pressure and whispers behind her back, Emily made the difficult decision to resign. She relocated to a smaller city and started anew as a consultant, a role that allowed her to work in solitude. The fallout forced her to reflect, turning her ambition inward in an effort to rebuild her life. Michael's public collapse. Michael's downfall was even more public and devastating. The forced resignation during the board meeting sent shockwaves through the industry. As word spread, his professional network began to unravel. Invitations to exclusive events dried up, and potential collaborators distanced themselves. Once seen as a charismatic leader, he was now regarded as a liability. Media attention amplified his disgrace. An influential business blog detailed the scandal, using Michael and Emily as cautionary tales of how personal failings could derail professional success. Headlines paired his face with biting commentary, eroding his once pristine reputation. Stripped of his status and influence, Michael retreated into a quieter life. He took a modest position at a nonprofit organization, far removed from the high-powered corporate world. For the first time in years, he focused on meaningful, grounded work, slowly learning to rebuild his life on a foundation of sincerity rather than image. David's path to renewal. For David, the fallout was less about collapse and more about transformation. The confrontation had been a turning point, forcing him to confront the pain head-on and find a way forward. Photography, his long-neglected passion, became his refuge. Through his lens, he found clarity, turning his emotions into art. Months later, David held an exhibit titled Reclamation. Each photograph told a story of resilience. A cracked mirror reflecting light, a lone tree standing firm in a storm, golden rays piercing through dense clouds. Visitors connected deeply with the pieces, many moved by their raw vulnerability. Jake, David's steadfast friend, was there every step of the way. Over beers at their usual pub, Jake often reminded him how far he'd come. "You didn't just survive, man. You found a way to thrive," he said, pride evident in his voice. New beginnings. The exhibit caught the attention of a renowned gallery, leading to a significant contract that cemented David's place in the art world. But his true success wasn't measured in accolades. It was in the peace he found within himself. The betrayal no longer haunted him. It had become a chapter in a larger story of growth and rediscovery. One sunny afternoon, David walked through the park and stopped at the cafe where he had met a fellow photography enthusiast months before. Their initial conversation had blossomed into a meaningful connection. As they laughed and shared ideas over coffee, David felt a profound sense of gratitude, resilience and transformation. The events that had once seemed like the end of his world were, in hindsight, a catalyst for change. The betrayal had been painful, but it had also pushed him to confront his vulnerabilities and reclaim his sense of purpose. The scars remained, not as reminders of pain but as symbols of strength. They were proof of his ability to face life's storms and emerge stronger, with a deeper appreciation for the life he was creating. The future now stretched before him, filled with light, possibility, and the unshakable resolve to shape it on his own terms. Closure and reflection. Sitting on a wooden bench by the lake, David let the morning air fill his lungs. The gentle rhythm of oars cutting through the water and the distant laughter of children playing on the grass surrounded him. In his hands, he cradled his camera, no longer a burden but an extension of his being, a tool for storytelling and ultimately healing. A year of transformation. Nearly a year had passed since the night that shattered his world. It had been a year of sleepless nights, raw pain, and countless questions. But as he looked out at the serene lake, he realized that those dark days had faded into the background. The hurt was still there, but it had softened, its edges no longer sharp, its presence more a reminder than a weight. Beside him lay a portfolio filled with photos from his exhibit, Reclamation. The series had exceeded his expectations, drawing attention not just for its artistry but for its emotional resonance. Each photo was a chapter of his story, jagged shards of a broken mirror reflecting soft light, a lone figure standing firm in a storm, and golden rays breaking through heavy clouds. They weren't just images, they were fragments of his soul, pieced together through months of introspection. A chance encounter with Emily. His thoughts wandered to the day Emily reached out, months after everything had come crashing down. She had asked to meet, and though he hesitated, he agreed. They met at a quiet cafe, far from the prying eyes of mutual acquaintances. Her apology was heartfelt, her voice trembling with regret. "I know I can't change what happened," she had said, tears welling in her eyes. "But I needed to say I'm sorry, for the betrayal, for the pain, for everything." David had listened, his emotions a mix of anger and sadness. He hadn't known what to say at the time, but as the weeks passed, he realized he didn't need to forgive her for her sake. He needed to let go for his own. Holding on to the pain had been exhausting, and releasing it had felt like shedding a weight he'd carried too long. Finding peace through passion. As for Michael, their paths never crossed again. David chose not to dwell on his downfall or seek updates about his life. Revenge wasn't what he wanted, it was enough to focus on reclaiming his own narrative. Through it all, Jake had been his rock. Over countless beers and late-night talks, Jake reminded him that life was full of second chances. "You're rebuilding, man," he had said once, clinking his glass against David's. "And look at what you're creating in the process." It was during this time that Lily walked into his life. She had discovered his work at the gallery and approached him with quiet admiration. What started as casual conversations about photography soon deepened into something more. Her presence was grounding, her insights a source of inspiration. "Scars tell stories," she had said during one of their walks through the park, gesturing to a tree with a weathered trunk. "And sometimes those stories are what make us most beautiful." Her words lingered with him, a reminder that even pain had its purpose. A future full of promise. As the sun rose higher, David stood from the bench, camera in hand. The park unfolded before him, alive with color and energy. He framed the lake in his viewfinder, the golden light shimmering off the water. The shot wasn't just a photograph, it was a statement, a testament to resilience and hope. Before leaving, he paused to capture one last image. The photo was simple yet profound, ripples spreading across the water, reflecting the soft hues of dawn. To him, it symbolized the journey, how one moment can ripple through a life, changing its shape but not its beauty. A message of resilience. David's scars would always be a part of him, but they no longer defined his story. Instead, they stood as proof of his strength, reminders of his capacity to endure and grow. As he stepped back into the city, the weight of the past felt lighter, the path ahead clearer. For those who might one day hear his story, he left a message. Life will break you in ways you never see coming. But in that breaking, you'll find pieces of yourself you never knew existed. Don't hide your scars. Let them tell your story. Move forward with courage, and know that even in your darkest moments, there's light waiting to guide you. With that, David walked on, his heart lighter, his spirit stronger, and his camera ready to capture the beauty of what lay ahead.